This is the BBC.
This podcast is supported by advertising outside the UK.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
Trainers, sneakers, kicks. Whatever you want to call them, they are among the most iconic cultural objects of our time. But their evolution is a story rarely told until now.
Can I kick it?
This podcast, Sneakernomics, is a close encounter with the visionaries, artisans, and journeymen who've made and been made by these objects. We'll follow in the footsteps of mavericks, hustlers, and dreamers, and hear their tales of boom and bust, fame and infamy, hope and heartbreak.
Can I kick it?
Sneakernomics, Episode 7, The Cri de Coeur. In the early 2000s, T-shirts bearing the question, "Where's Jeff Johnson?" began appearing at stalls in London's Camden and Portobello markets.
It's a blocky font, just says "Where's Jeff Johnson?" with a question mark, and it's got a hand-drawn representation of one of the Nike shoes that he designed underneath it.
The shirts were made by Russ Gator and Dan Savory, two designers with the heritage brand TSPTR, who were also avid collectors of all things related to Nike's early days. Here's Russ.
It's kind of like a sort of paean to the golden age that we felt was the golden age of sneakers, which was the late 70s, very early 80s. And basically saying, where's Jeff Johnson when you need him? You know, where's somebody designing a shoe where the functionality comes first, but then the aesthetic is also amazing. Somebody with that kind of verve that he had for design. He was, the heart and soul of Nike at that point. And it just seemed everything had become really plastic and kind of diluted to us.
So, where was Jeff Johnson when you needed him? The man who had named Nike, whose passion for running and unceasing dedication to runners made him the beating heart of the fledgling athletic shoe company. Well, we'll come to that later, but in the late 1970s, he was building shoes at the company's lab in Exeter, New Hampshire. Not just any shoes, but ones with a new technology.
Cushioning, run on air. I mean, the whole idea of running on air was almost an idea as opposed to running on pavement.
That's Jeff. Part of what fueled Nike's success during the running boom was the comfortable, cushy shoes it made for joggers. The Air technology promised to take that comfort to a whole new level.
It came about through an outside inventor whose name was Frank Rudy, who was an aerospace engineer with Rockwell International. He conceived of the idea of a sealable bag of gases that could act as a cushioning device for athletic footwear.
Before Jeff and the Exeter factory got its hands on them, the airbags almost ended up in the competition's hands.
And he first took it to Adidas, and they turned him down.
Then they had the good fortune that Adidas looked at the Nike Air.
Longtime Adidas executive, John Bolter.
And Mr. Dazzler and the technicians at Adidas looked at it and said,
"What?
You know, air."
Air?
Yeah.
Where?
Inside the shoe, just under the heel.
Why?
Cuts the weight right down.
So, what about the support?
It's supported.
But the weight's there to support the ankle. Hardly going to support your ankle if you're sliding around on top of a balloon.
It's a little more sophisticated than that.
Is it? Looks to me like a very expensive balloon.
Well, go on. Walk around a little. Try it.
Okay.
Isn't that comfortable?
It feels like a mattress.
Isn't that good?
No. How much pressure can it take?
A couple 100 pounds, give or take.
Per foot or per pair?
Per pair. And we tested it on the biggest guy in our lab.
Uh-huh. And what did he weigh?
200, 210. It easily cushions the footfall of an average man, no problem.
How about someone like Kareem Abdul-Jabbar? Do you know how much he weighs?
No, sir.
225. A lot of pressure goes into his feet when he comes down from the basket. And you can double that if he lands on one foot.
It's just a prototype for now, but...
How's that gonna look if his party balloon pops when he touches down?
It can be adapted for a man like that.
And what if he rolls over on his balloon? He could easily break an ankle landing on something with so little support.
All I'm asking is that you see the vision.
Of putting air inside a shoe?
Just Wear it around for a few hours.
It's a gimmick.
It's so much more than that.
Gimmicks are only for small kings, like Nike. Thank you for your time.
Frank Rudy, the aerospace engineer behind the soul-sized airbags, wasn't deterred.
And then he took it to Nike, to Portland, and I don't know who he spoke with there, but Phil eventually got in the discussion, and he wasn't rejected.
I'm sorry, he called us what?
Small kings.
What does that even mean?
Maybe he means princes.
He doesn't mean princes. He wouldn't be that nice.
Then maybe he means, like, Napoleon.
Yeah.
Thinks we're short asses, like old Nappy.
Napoleon wasn't short.
Yes, he was.
He's only considered short because British cartoonists at the time didn't realize a French inch was shorter than an imperial inch, so Napoleon was actually a man of an average height for the time.
Dude, how do you know this crap?
I'm just trying to be constructive.
Show us this thing, this gimmick.
It's not a gimmick, sir.
It's a balloon.
It's an air pocket. Saves on the weight.
So how do you make sure you keep the shoe's structure?
You reinforce around the side.
Doesn't that just put the weight back in?
There's a lot of R&D still to do, but...
Yeah, it's a gimmick.
I like it.
You do?
Oh, yeah. I don't think it's anywhere near product ready, but I bet he could make something over in Exeter.
Who?
Johnson. What do you want for it?
Like a price?
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to be cheap.
Thought everyone else turned you down.
Sure, but...
We'll pay whatever you want. I like it.
We'll discuss it.
I want it. We can afford it. And Air's got a nice ring. Sign him up. Small King's my ass.
But he very quickly sent back to Exeter because that was where we had a research lab up and running, sample room, where we could start trying to figure out a way to make it work.
We had to get patent protection first. We didn't want people to know what we were pumping into that air sole. It was very closely guarded secret.
First, Johnson and the other designers had to get their heads around the chemicals.
We weren't urethane chemists. We didn't know anything about that. We were basically just a marketing company trying to figure out how to make shoes.
It's just a little blowout.
The first shoe to feature Nike's air technology was the Tailwind, a running shoe first released in 1978, just in time for the Honolulu Marathon. The plastic airbags were embedded within the shoe's thick foam insole. An ad in the influential magazine Runner's World that year compared the shoe with the Wright brothers' first airplane flight. Yet the initial excitement for the Tailwind wore out. The shoe's upper had a habit of separating from the rest of the sneaker, not the type of blowout people expected from a shoe with an air pocket, but still. But as Nike approached its initial public offering in 1980, company executives were convinced that air was the future. The company continued to devote resources to the project and prove to the public that running on air was the way to go. After all, what company knew running better than Nike?
My name is Ace, and again, I'm joined by Nick to give you all things sneakers and trainers. Now, in this episode, we are going to be talking about the introduction of air in shoes. Now, this didn't really pop off until people could actually see the air. Isn't that right, Nick?
Yeah, that's right. Even though Nike had been making air pockets in their shoes since the late 70s, it's a bit of a tough sell to say there's air in the shoe if you can't see the air. Right. So it really took off with the introduction of the Nike Air Max 1 in 1987. So what made the shoe different was it kind of had little cutaways in the midsole. That's the squishy part in the middle of the shoe, where you can actually see the air pocket. Now, I remember when these came out, that my favorite thing to do as a 5 or 6 year old was poke the air pocket with my finger in the stores. But it really kind of allowed the customer to kind of see what's going on under the hood.
So when exactly did Nike decide to make the Air visible, and when exactly did that come about?
So when they were preparing to release the Air Max 1, the shoe designer that they had work on this was a guy named Tinker Hatfield. He's, one of the legendary designers for that company. But at the time, he was kind of in a different department of the company that was moving into shoe design. He had an architecture background, so he had been designing kind of the interiors of stores and that kind of thing. And now he, took that architecture sensibility into shoes. Now, why this is important is Without that architecture background, maybe he wouldn't have seen the proper inspiration for that cutaway that we know today where you can, poke that air bubble with your finger. That inspiration was the Pompidou Center in Paris. Now, for those of you who haven't seen the Pompidou Center, what it is a building that looks like it's been turned inside out. So instead of, walls on the outside, you see pipes, you see, a couple of escalators, you see everything that's on the inside of the building outside. And as the story goes, this gave Tinker Hatfield the idea, so I need to show the airbag what's inside the shoe from the outside. So here we have an instance of something from outside of the sneaker world, in this case architecture, impacting sneaker design.
Genius.
Yeah, and it's also, worth mentioning that because the Air Max line was so successful, they started coming out with Air Maxes every single year. And I remember some from the 90s that, instead of a little slit where you can see the air bubble, the entire midsole was an air bubble. I want to say this was the Air Max 97 or 98. And these shoes, were brought out again a couple years ago. I mean, Nike is still, re-releasing a lot of its classic lines. And I think they have some big ad campaign from those years, Kiss My Airs. So really, Air is very much an integral part of Nike's marketing today.
We heard Adidas's kind of reservation about the air bubble and how sturdy it would be and how much it would, the impact would be on heavier athletes. Did that ever come into play when the Air came out? Did anybody get injured, or was there any backlash that came with the introduction of Air?
On the highest level, I can't recall any sort of backlash on there. But, if you remember nowadays, there's always the odd instance of a basketball player blowing out their brand new prototype shoe because they're just putting too much stress on it. So if you remember from a couple years ago when he was in college, Zion Williams, the young basketball star, he made a quick pivot on one of his new Nike shoes and the thing just completely blew apart. And it was a bit of a sore spot for Nike because here's kind of the top prospect of that year destroying a shoe you really want him to wear in the NBA. So, it happens today. It probably happened then, but, it's just one of those hazards of shoemaking, I guess.
So the Air Max was marketed as a running trainer by Nike in America, and we've spoken loads about the running boom in the States. Right now, we're going to find out more about how the running boom took over in the UK.
Oh, bloody hell. Ow. Come here. Oh.
In the United States, Nike rode a jogging wave that began in the early 1970s by enthusiasts looking for ways to get and stay fit. In the UK, that wave arrived slightly later, and from a different origin, club athletes and high-profile finishes by British runners.
I think it started with these elite athletes, and the first wave of a running boom, if you look back, say, at London, me and my wife did the first London. I ran 2:22, I was 35th in the race, but I was about 30th Brit,
That's Mike Deegan. He's a self-confessed running obsessive, something that his partner regularly has to contend with.
She said, "You're obsessive." I said, "No, I'm not." I said, "You brush your teeth every day, don't you?" He said, "Yeah." I said, "It's the same for me running." And, I think Ron would probably say the same.
Mike's talking about Ron Hill, winner of the 1970 Boston Marathon, sports clothing entrepreneur, and fellow running obsessive. Ron Hill lays claim to the longest streak of consecutive days running every day for 52 years and 39 days.
Oh, you best not be thinking of getting out of that bed, Mr. Hill.
There's no law says you can keep me.
I'm not worried about the law, mister. I'm worried you'll pull the drip stand over. Or the end's jammed up your arm.
Oh.
It was Ron who first started importing Nike to the UK.
Everything in the 70s was either Adidas or Puma. And this little upstart brand in America called Nike came along, and Ron, with his travels across the pond, was coming back with some brightly coloured shoes and going to races at a weekend, getting these bright coloured, everything was just bright and vivid. And they had this new waffle sole on, so, again, of the time.
Mike began working with Ron in 1978, and, just as Jeff Johnson had done in California 10 years earlier, they started their business as mail order only, and sought out new customers on the running tracks.
So he'd just load up the van with some shoes in the back and, sell a few shoes before the race and sell a few pairs after the race. But yeah, I might be going to a race on a Saturday, somebody else might be going on a Sunday. So you do your race on Saturday and then drop the van off with the next guy on Saturday night, and he'd take it to the next race on the Sunday, And then we'd argue about who'd scratch the van on Monday morning when we all got back to work,
Well, I can't reach the remote.
What channel are you after?
One, please.
Remote doesn't work anyway. Last bloke in your bed pinched the batteries on his way out.
In 1980, America boycotted the Moscow Olympics because of the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan. 4 years later, the USSR returned the favor and boycotted the 1984 Games in Los Angeles. The 1980 boycott was a tragedy for many U.S. athletes who had missed a once-in-a-lifetime chance to compete on sports' biggest stage. But for Team GB, the absence of the American team provided a golden opportunity, especially if your name was Stephen Ovett or Sebastian Coe.
Right, there, that's BBC One. You been watching?
A bit. You?
Not so into the running in circles lot, but I like the swimming. The diving in particular.
Oh, right.
Like sides of granite, those lads. Who's this, anyway?
1,500-metre final should be about to start.
Oh, that these two fellas are banging on about.
Ovett and Coe, that's right, yeah.
Which is the one who lost?
Coe on the right got silver in the 800.
That's hardly losing.
Well, it is to him, believe me.
And they're both in it again, are they?
Yes, Ovett's on the left, Coe on the right.
Oh, I don't like Coe.
You not like a side of granite?
He reminds me of my Uncle Alf.
That good or bad?
Depends who you ask.
Alan Wells won the 100 metres. That wouldn't have happened with an American boycott. Daley Thompson won the decathlon, but the big one, the big rivalry was the Ovett and Coe thing, you know? Ovett beat Coe in the 800, and 4 days later Coe came back.
Go on. Yes, that's it. Stay on him.
He came back and, against all odds, beat Ovett.
Yes!
So there was this fantastic rivalry between the two of them. Ovett was the bad guy and Coe was the good guy, you know, and there was so much focus on those two guys being the best two middle distance runners in the world at the time. You know, it was phenomenal, really.
The gold medals from the Ovett-Coe rivalry fueled Britain's burgeoning interest in running. Here's John Bolter, who ran 800 metres at the 1964 Olympics in Tokyo.
It didn't come out of nowhere. Chris Brasher and John Disley didn't sit down and say, let's have 20,000 people running the London Marathon. They started it because there was already enough people running.
Have a bit of an addiction.
To watching the running?
To doing the running.
All right. Running where? In circles like this lot?
Well, anywhere. It's good. You should try it.
Why?
Well, it's good for you. Keeps you young. Faster than the bus.
Oh, faster than the bus.
Oh, by a long shot.
Don't be daft.
Oh, where do you live?
Poynton.
Right. Well, have you ever tried to get to Sheffield on a Sunday on a bus?
Why would I want to go to Sheffield on a Sunday?
Oh, do you never work weekends?
Not anymore.
Oh, right. Well, you say you had to, by bus. Impossible. But lace up a pair of shoes.
What kind of maniac runs from Stockport to Sheffield on a Sunday?
It doesn't have to be a Sunday.
I mean, that's the best part of, 30 miles?
26.2, as the crow flies.
Well, it's not hard for a crow, but on foot...
A couple of hills, nothing much.
You've run from Stockport to Sheffield?
Oh, many times.
Well, don't say that round here too loud, love, or they'll have you sectioned under the Mental Health Act.
The first London Marathon was in 1981, started by club runners Chris Brasher and John Disley.
And then 6 months later, and possibly in the shadow of it, Brendan started the Great North Run.
Brendan Foster, the 10,000-metre bronze medalist in the 1976 Olympics and BBC Sports commentator.
I think you had sort of like a perfect storm there, really, where you had Brasher with his connections with the media anyway, Brendan lesser so, but obviously he was a bit of a cult figure that, you know, the BBC would send the crew up to cover the games at Gateshead or the cross-country that he used to put on in the winter. So I think you then had that connection of the events, the right time, and the fact that the BBC was covering those events. So I think those elements coming together, I would say the genesis of the boom was around then, you know?
The boom was quick to catch on.
Everyone's doing it.
Doesn't make it right.
Well, it's quite the thing in London.
Is it really?
Newcastle have had hundreds of runners. London Marathon, thousands. It's very exciting.
It's an invitation for a hip replacement.
Not with the right kit. Manchester, Blackpool, they've all got marathons going. Hell, there's even a half on the cards in Stockport.
I think what happened in the early 80s was suddenly everybody had a new goal, like, I'm going to do a marathon. So then we find that London Marathon becomes Birmingham, becomes Manchester, becomes Leeds, becomes Bolton, becomes Blackpool, you know. So every major town and city seemed to have a marathon.
Didn't the fella die?
Oh.
The fella who actually ran from wherever to Marathon in Greece.
Oh, Pheidippides?
Yeah, him.
Yeah, he was running away from Marathon.
Oh, I don't blame him.
To Athens, with news of the Greek victory over Persia.
And he died, right? When he got there?
Yes, but to be fair, he wasn't wearing the right shoes.
As you move through into the 90s, we've still got the marathons, but they're all about fundraising. Then we've got things like Race for Life and all these other elements, which are all about charities and raising money. And then ultimately you move right on to today and, you know, Couch to 5K, Park Run, all these things that I think is just, you know, an evolution from a beginning that was essentially driven by club athletes rather than joggers or runners.
Now, 40 years since the first London Marathon, Britain's roads and lanes are teeming with weekend warriors and running obsessives like Mike. However, surely not even the most hardcore fanatic can lay claim to Ron Hill's record.
So how many of these have you done then?
Marathons? Oh, 20, 30, I've lost count. I tell you what though, there hasn't been a day in near 20 years where I haven't gone for a run.
You've been for a run every day for 20 years?
Almost.
How old are you?
Well, I did say it keeps you young.
Since you put it that way, maybe I will. I'll spend a fortune on face cream.
He'd been over to Yorkshire. He was coming back over a road called the Snake Pass, which is between sort of Sheffield and Manchester. Ron liked to drive a fast car, and he'd drive like a racing driver.
And that's what brought you in, was it?
How do you mean?
Saw in your notes you'd been involved in a collision over the peaks. You get hit by a car or something, taken after Pheidippides.
No, I was in the car, came off the road up at Snake Pass.
Oh, you're going too fast.
I might have been. It's a write-off.
Then you'll have to take the bus back. Let's hope you're not discharged on a Sunday.
I got this phone call at work, and this gasping guy, it's Ron here. I've had a car accident.
Between December 1964 and 2017, Ron ran every single day. That's 19,032 days in total.
Basically, on a narrow road, he'd gone to overtake someone. I had a head-on crash, and the steering wheel smacked into his chest. So he was in hospital, and I was obviously very concerned.
About that, I was rather hoping you could help me out.
With what?
An early discharge.
It's not my shout, love.
No, but you could put in a word. 20 years I've been out on the road every single day. I can't miss one just 'cause I'm trapped on a poxy ward.
You're trapped because you broke half your ribs, you plonker.
Yeah, but I feel all right to do it.
To do what?
To go for a run. Go on. Let me out.
I really don't think that's a good idea, sweetheart.
Oh, okay.
But you are free to walk out of your own accord. If you can walk, that is.
Then have you got a phone I could use? I think I might call a friend, see if he can bring me shoes.
Possibly.
I could ask him to bring a pair of shoes for you as well, if you like.
Possibly.
After a short, fairly breathless chat, he said, "Could you go up to our house and get me running kit?" And the next morning, he got out of the hospital, went to the local running track, and we debate whether a mile in 15 minutes was actually running. But, you know, he was determined he's going to keep the streak going by running a mile that day, even though he was in pretty bad shape. You know? Obsessive is the word, probably, isn't it?
So this week's trainer of the episode is the classic Air Force One. I've mentioned it a few times during the course of this series, but yeah, this was definitely one of my favorite trainers of the noughties.
Yeah, now it first came out in 1982, and that's also when it made its debut in the NBA. But the Air Force One has a very interesting history. So it came out and then it was discontinued. So you think about this, really influential shoe today. There's so many different color variations. There's so many different types of people wearing it, and they discontinued it. So in 1985, there was a couple of retailers in Baltimore that knew the potential of this shoe. So they were, telling Nike, look, you got to re-release this basketball shoe, but maybe make it in a few other colors. And they did that. And the shoe's popularity continued to grow and blossom from there because, it started to be offered in so many different ways. And what's also notable about the Air Force One is it became very popular, not just in Baltimore, but everything up and down the East Coast that was connected to Baltimore. So this is how you saw it get big in Philadelphia. You saw it get big in New York, in Washington, D.C., all because of the foresight of these, innovative retailers.
And for me, like being a music fan and a music board, the Air Force One was probably the most famous trainer of that noughties era. Every rapper had a pair of Air Force Ones on, and the white low Air Force Ones were definitely the most bought trainer of that time. Even me, I can't tell you how many pairs of clean white on white low Air Force Ones I had. I used to, this is really embarrassing, but I'm going to tell people this. I used to just keep a box fresh Air Force Ones in the back of my car at any point because I didn't know where I was going to go. And if I had to go out and I just needed a pair of clean trainers on, I would just jump in the back of my car and put these on. And if I ever had to wear those, I always knew in the back of my mind, I got to go and buy a pair of clean Air Force Ones for the boot.
You got to have one to rock and one to stock. So, exactly. That's perfectly understandable with those white on whites.
White on whites. And they went with everything. You see like Jay-Z wearing them with a suit. You see them with jeans, obviously with a tracksuit. They were just like the go-to shoe for everybody during that time.
Yeah, and part of that is, I think nowadays there's something like 2,000 different styles of the Air Force One that have been brought out in its almost 40-year history. So, whatever sort of color combination, fabrics, anything you can think of, there's probably one already released out there.
And like I said, hip-hop was definitely gravitated towards the Air Force One, and we heard so much music that have actually got trainer references. Nelly actually had a song called Air Force Ones.
Yeah, and that came out right in that era that you were talking about. So the 2000s. So 2002, off his second album, he comes out with this song, Air Force Ones, that is all about buying Air Force Ones and the many different varieties there are.
I remember for the 25th anniversary of the Air Force One, Kanye West, Nas, KRS-One, and I believe Rakim, and I think DJ Premier produced it, a song called Classic, which was about the Air Force One as well. I don't know if that was like, if Nike actually commissioned them to make this record, but I know it came out during the 25th anniversary of the Air Force One.
Yeah, who knows? But it's, if they didn't, it's, tons of free advertising out there. But, there's so many songs that mention so many different sneakers. I'm thinking Wale 88, he's talking about his Air Jordan 3s, how he's, buying them for all his friends. I'm thinking Raekwon's sneakers, where he's talking about all the different brands of sneakers he likes. I mean, the list goes on and on about, sneaker-inspired music.
We started off by talking about My Adidas.
Yeah, which is probably the most famous song there is about sneakers. And, it could be the most famous song there ever will be about sneakers.
So we heard earlier in the series that Run DMC were responsible for making Adidas not just a sports brand, but more of a fashion brand. But here in the UK, trainers took a different route from sport to fashion, and we're going to hear about that right now.
From a sociological perspective, subcultures like running can influence other areas like fashion, which places a value on authenticity and exclusivity. Trainers moving from sport to casual in the UK took a different path than the US. In the 1970s, especially in major cities like New York, basketball stars like Walt Frazier provided a currency of cool for sneakers from the top down, while growing subcultures of hip-hop and street basketball provided the cool from the bottom up. In the UK, that shift came from different places. Here's designer and brand consultant Gary Aspden.
The first person I am aware of who wore trainers outside of the realms of athletics and sport was Nick Mason from Pink Floyd, the drummer. He was wearing Adidas trainers in some footage of Pink Floyd from around 1967. The Beatles were very influenced by Pink Floyd around that time. Not long after that, you see John Lennon wearing Adidas trainers. And at that time, it was unthinkable that people would wear those things off the sports pitch.
All this contributed to the casual movement.
This thing started to happen in the northwest of England, which was what's now known as casual fashion. A lot of people joined the dots between that look and David Bowie's look for the movie The Man Who Fell to Earth. In the opening scene of that, he's got that kind of wedge foppish haircut with the duffel coat, parallel trousers and boots. Bowie had a big influence on the early casuals. So in the UK, certainly in the Northwest, they kind of got into it in the late 70s. And that then took on a kind of a life of its own and has continued to inform British menswear and British men's fashion ever since, really.
So, how do you define casual?
The whole casual thing in the UK, it was like the mindset of mod, which was that thing of clean living under difficult conditions, coupled with the attitude of punk. So there was something very subversive about it. Kids from terraced houses and council estates, things like Giorgio Armani and Hugo Boss were not meant for kids like that. And it was almost this thing of, well, we're not supposed to wear this, but we're going to take it anyway. It was a real kind of two fingers up to the establishment. It was taking products that were kind of quite bourgeois by nature and subverting them and putting them onto like young scallywags who were coming out of housing estates.
Yet there was one thing connecting the burgeoning sneaker fashion movement in the States with what was happening in Britain.
Part of the whole casual culture was always this mindset of one-upmanship, of trying to sort of outdo the next man, outdress the next man.
Cultural historians take note. The UK's love of trainers was very much homegrown.
One thing that is for sure is that this thing that was happening in Britain, particularly around football culture, was happening before hip-hop kicked off in America. A lot of people, when they talk about trainers, will relate that back to hip-hop. But if you look at kind of images of early rappers, they look like disco people. It was only when you get into the 80s and you get people like Run DMC that kind of took on that kind of timeless look.
Remember, one of the things that set Run DMC apart from their hip-hop predecessors was that they took inspiration from the people in their neighborhood of Queens, New York.
Part of the reason sneaker culture has travelled globally in the way that it has is because it's always been intrinsically linked with a music culture, i.e. with hip-hop culture, which is arguably the dominant force in global culture nowadays.
There was another key demographic that fueled the casual style: football fans. Here's author Neil Hurd, who's written about trainers and football fashion.
Football in itself, and most sports, but particularly football, is very, very tribal. It's all about belonging. It's club colours, it's your town, it's your city, it's, civic pride, it's somebody representing you, literally us against them. And then you add in the area to manifest for the working class young man to sort of show his steel and show his stripes. It's kind of like a place to be a dandy. It was the fans themselves who picked up on the shoes and decided that they want to wear them to express themselves and to stand out and to belong, and they just thought they looked good. And there's not too many trends which are like that. It's normally the big brands come along and tell you what to do, but certainly with the casuals and with hip-hop across the other side of the pond, it was actually just the streets telling the brands what they wanted,
Between 1977 and 1984, Liverpool Football Club won the European Cup 4 times. The club's success meant that their fans got to go on a lot of away games in search of glory and treasure.
Going back to that point of how it started with Liverpool, the fans following their teams in Europe, doing so well in the European Cup, they were bringing back models to the UK which you couldn't get in the UK. And I think that's the kind of interesting thing which sort of shows up in it. And there was that kind of like one-upmanship to sort of have a pair of shoes that nobody else could get.
In other words, sneaker collecting grew out of this desire to show off something no one else had.
I actually spent a few years of the early 90s going around the world. Started with Britain, then went to Europe, and then went to the States looking for the old models of training shoes. It's sometimes referred to as digging nowadays, where you go digging for dead stock shoes. And we used to actually go and knock on the doors of brands like Nike and Adidas and say, look, people are looking for these old style shoes and you don't make them anymore. Why don't you start making them? And they just laughed at us. They didn't know what we were on about. And Nike actually said things like, no, we're a forward-looking company. We don't look back.
As Neil Hurd says, that sentiment was common for brands at that time. The concept of vintage, originals, or reissues was years away. But in the early 1980s, Nike still had to figure out who it wanted to be.
So we've heard loads this series about male athletes, but what was it like for the female runners at that time?
Well, it definitely wasn't the same for female runners, and they didn't have the same opportunities, competitive or otherwise, that male runners did at the time. So let me talk a bit about the Boston Marathon. Now, this is probably the most famous, the most exclusive marathon in the world. So many people want to run it that you have to qualify for it nowadays. But for the longest time, only men could run the Boston Marathon, and that started to change in the 1960s. Now, there was a runner named Bobby Gibb. In 1966, she became the first woman to complete the Boston Marathon. Now, she did it without registering. She wouldn't have been able to run the race according to the guidelines at the time because she was a woman. But that didn't stop her from running the race not once, not twice, but 3 times, 66 through 68. She was the de facto women's winner of that year. She's since been recognized now as winners during those years, but at the time, of course not. It's also worth mentioning another runner from around that time, Kathrine Switzer. Now, Bobby Gibb was the first person to complete the marathon, though she didn't register. Kathrine Switzer was the first woman to actually register for the race. Of course, this was still during the time when women were not allowed to register. How she got around that was she used her initials, KV Switzer, to get in, and they issued her a number. So one of the race organizers saw her running and ran up to her and tried to rip the number right off of her shirt. Now, her boyfriend at the time kind of muscled him away, and this was all happening at the same time that the truck carrying all of the press photographers was going by. So, of course, they were, snapping pictures of the entire incident happening, which made the front pages the next day and kind of shone a light on this unfair practice of barring women from running.
Nick, the 70s were a time of change for women in sports, wasn't it?
Yeah, for sure. This is around the time of the famous Battle of the Sexes tennis match. I don't know if you saw the movie they made of it from a couple of years ago, but this is a famous tennis match between Billie Jean King and Bobby Riggs, and man versus woman, who's going to be the best? And it was kind of trumped up as what we would see as an incredibly sexist thing today, but at the time it was a bit revolutionary. And of course, Billie Jean King won that famous tennis match. And, afterwards, Adidas brought out a special Billie Jean King edition shoe named for her. So this is also kind of a momentous note from the shoe company perspective. But it wasn't just running. It wasn't just women's professional tennis that was changing in the 1970s. Now, in America, the 1970s also saw the passage of what we know as Title IX. Now, if you're not familiar with Title IX, it basically says that if you're a university, you have to give equal funding and equal opportunities in sports to men as in women. So this is around the time that you saw a lot of universities really develop their women's sports programs. And, because you had a strong collegiate women's sports program, you now had the opportunity for a strong women's professional programs in many different sports. So as we've talked about, the 1970s saw a lot of different changes, not just with fashion, not just with technology, but also in gender equality. Here's Professor Akilah Carter-Francique talking about the importance of that Title IX legislation.
Being able to be fit to go into these spaces with other women, be empowered in these spaces is something that is very important. And I think it was very important to the movement because we were told at one time that if we exerted any sort of physical force that our ovaries would fall out, right? But, we as women began to sort of unlock these doors that had been closed while in many ways, yes, some may deem it as hey, this is just fitness, but it allowed women to get outside the home, to congregate and to socialize and to have these intellectual conversations with other women and know that we have a voice, know that we have talents and skills. So I'm appreciative of those founding foremothers that really pushed the limits to find a space in the sporting world because it's done a lot to not only increase access and opportunity for my generation, but even for my daughter's generation.
In the early 2000s, Russ Gator had a market stall in London that sold t-shirts that celebrated Nike's early designs.
They featured references or depictions of our favourite sneakers. So there were drawings of very, very obscure, at the time, they looked really interesting. So we would draw a picture, have some kind of odd reference on there that we found amusing and put them on a t-shirt.
One such t-shirt was emblazoned with a hand-drawn image of a classic 1970s Nike running shoe and bore the question, "Where's Jeff Johnson?" For Russ, it was a paean to the golden age of sneakers.
You look at somebody like Jeff Johnson or any of those earlier sort of late 70s developers of shoes, their primary target was something with functionality. Once the functionality was there, they'd then apply some kind of aesthetic to it, and usually that was done in a fantastic way. Whereas back in the 70s and early 80s, it was a handful of people, and it was kind of like, right, you're in charge of that, you've got autonomy. They go, okay, I'm going to do this, and that's what happened. And that's why you get something that has got so much power behind it.
But the question, "Where's Jeff Johnson?" also implies lament.
I think now there's too much of you've got probably one team functionality, one team on the aesthetic. They're kind of not necessarily convergent.
So why was Russ sending a mayday signal to Nike's first employee? Here's Jeff Johnson himself remembering Nike's transition period.
The first guys in the door, we had this kind of magical understanding of what this was all about. And it was something we shared. It was the passion of the athlete and for the athlete customers.
Going public made co-founders Phil Knight and Bill Bowerman and other executives millionaires. Yet that success came at the cost of the company culture. Here's Julie Dixon, who co-wrote the book Swoosh, the unauthorized story of Nike and the men who played there.
They always say some people drive the train and some people lay the tracks. And those guys laid the tracks. And driving the train is a completely different skill set. Management is completely different than entrepreneurialism, which is why so many entrepreneurs end up losing or leaving their own companies, is because that's just not their bailiwick to manage people.
In 1981, worried at the way he saw the company shift away from its primary focus of running, Jeff Johnson wrote a 10-page cri de coeur.
Hello?
Carmody's pissed.
Hey, Buck.
What did you say to Carmody?
The letter.
The letter?
Yeah, on strategy. I sent it to you, too.
Well, what did it say?
You didn't read it?
Of course not.
Why not?
I never read your letters.
That hurts my feelings, Buck.
I have never read your letters. Never once. It hurts my feelings that you keep sending them.
Well, this one matters. They all mattered, but this one...
was 10 pages of single-spaced type. Don't give me crap for not reading it. Carmody's pissed.
Okay.
Says you're telling him how to do his job?
I am.
Why?
'Cause you're not.
It was a memo to the marketing manager about how to sell running shoes. And in fact, humbly titled, "How to Do Your Job," because I'm a kind of an in-your-face kind of a guy. That's sort of my approach, And also because the marketing manager was a fellow buttface, and he knew where I was coming from.
That expression wasn't an insult. Buttface was an affectionate term Johnson had coined to describe Nike's boisterous management retreats. Yet his memo was anything but boisterous. It drew parallels between the perceived weakness of Adidas's distance between the company and the marketplace, and what Johnson saw as Nike falling into the same trap. The company was growing at such speed that it felt like the men who built it were losing control.
Well, your tomes really upset Carmody.
It's not a tome.
You're like the Victor Hugo of bitching. This thing's your Les Miserables.
I thought you liked Victor Hugo.
Not when it comes to complaints. Why are you grinding his gears?
We need to hire our own sales reps. We're losing control over what they're selling. They keep going off in their own directions.
The business is flying.
But look at the forecast.
Share prices sky high.
But beyond next year, what's in the product line?
A million things.
Exactly. We're losing focus.
Then why are you taking it out of marketing?
Because the sales reps are telling him what to do when it should be the other way around. The tail's wagging the dog.
A beautiful tail, though.
Sure, but when it's that way round, you better be careful what comes out of its butt.
Now, you're being way too negative, Jeff.
I'm just trying to call it out.
The customers love the products.
But the lines we're putting out are far too wide.
Like what?
Air, for one.
It's the best line.
But it has no direction. It's amorphous.
Amorphous?
It just spreads out, leaks out into all the dead space.
By name, by nature.
Exactly. The customer might like it now, but they're going to get tired of it, and it's not in the sales rep's interest to keep an eye out for a dip when they're too concerned about keeping themselves in the money.
So what do you suggest?
Bringing them in-house. At least until we can figure out what's best for us to sell.
And what is best for us to sell?
Great shoes. That's what we've always done. We've got to be gold, not glitter.
Bringing the the sales reps in-house is expensive.
Be a lot less than it'll cost to regain the market share we're leaking to our competitors. It's the same thing happened to Adidas. Company got too far from the coalface.
You think we're like Adidas?
I think we're becoming that way, for sure.
Oh, that really hurts.
It really would help if you read these things instead of calling me at the smallest hour.
If I read the things you wrote, I'd have no time left to run the company.
The freewheeling early days of butt-face meetings would need to fit a company that was pulling in hundreds of millions each increasing year.
Business can't be run with the recklessness and the brotherly love that it was run in the early days. And it's multi-million dollars, it's global, you're around the world now in different cultures with different people with different backgrounds. How do you keep the culture alive? And that's been the big problem and the big question ever since.
In 1983, the company pulled in nearly $900 million in revenues. Profits, however, were down. Nike was also trying to fend off an upstart competitor, but that's a story for another time. Meanwhile, Johnson had grown increasingly disenchanted.
I didn't feel like I was doing a good job because I didn't really understand what my job was. In the early summer of '83, and I'm seeing this push for air, and everything is air, and I wasn't comfortable with that either because we weren't making good shoes anymore, and we were getting away from the things that had gotten us to our success. I was uncomfortable personally. I thought the company was going in a wrong direction because we were growing in basketball and running was starting to shrink as a proportion of what we did, and now we were getting away from the athlete. We had that incredible 17, 18, 20 years, and now those days are over. And it's now becoming corporate, it's becoming weird, it's becoming compromised, I don't fit in that environment. I didn't know how to do it, and I didn't want to do it. And so I just said, I'm out of here. And then I was like telling you, everybody looked at me, and you could see they were thinking exactly the same thing. He said, "You son of a bitch." A couple of them wanted to go out the door with me,
Nike may have beaten Adidas in the US, but its financial troubles remained. For one, the cast-a-wide net strategy the company employed to make athletes Nike athletes worked a little too well. Now, thousands of those athletes were costing the company. To make the situation more challenging, Nike had to not only cut back on these endorsements, but then shift that marketing money to advertising. More critically, it didn't have a shoe that ignited the imagination the way the Cortez or the Waffle Trainer once did. Nike designer Peter Moore recalls one big opportunity coming up in 1984.
Everything was focused on trying to make Nike the unofficial brand of the Olympic Games, which to us meant that you had to own LA.
Head of marketing Rob Strasser wrote a memo detailing the strategy that would become the marketing playbook for decades to come.
Individual athletes, even more than teams, will be the heroes. Symbols more and more of what real people can't do anymore. Risk and win.
There hadn't been a Summer Games on American soil since 1932, before co-founder Phil Knight was even born. Nike, therefore, had to make the most of the 1984 Olympics that were coming to Los Angeles.
Billboards, athletes, not just track and field, but basketball, football, baseball players. We just put our arms around sport in LA, focused on the Olympics.
This is Nelson Ferris, who's been with Nike since the early 70s.
And then the luck of the draw was Randy Newman wrote the song called I Love LA. And we thought, yes, so we cut a deal with him to use the music and to do our ad. And the story goes that he said he would let us use the ad for $5,000 if he could be in the ad. We said, of course. So we do an I Love LA. We have all these great pictures of athletes, and the music was perfect. It was all about Los Angeles. And at the end of the day, we made Los Angeles feel good about themselves.
The ad resembled a music video more than a commercial for a shoe company, with Randy Newman driving a red Buick convertible down sunny streets lined with high-rises, palm trees, and people enjoying the California sunshine.
Everything worked. Everything was connected. It was fun. It was not heavy. We weren't selling shoes at all. We were selling sport and our connectivity to it.
The I Love LA spot was the brainchild of advertising agency Chiat & Day and featured cheeky moments like Carl Lewis long-jumping past bikini-clad beachgoers or tennis star John McEnroe arguing with a traffic cop. Here was a contemporary update to the now crusty version of the California Cool exemplified by the Beach Boys. Interspersed between all these quick cuts are people holding Nike gear, athletes running in the streets, or the company's billboard campaign. Here, larger-than-life athletes seem to leap right off the billboards and buildings.
I remember somebody saying, do you want to see the life-size mural or the bigger-than-life-size mural that Nike painted of you on one of the walls on an abandoned building in Watts?
Olympic marathon runner Joan Benoit Samuelson.
And I said, I don't know, maybe that'll bring me bad luck. And then I decided I would, and then I had the knee issues. And ironically, I couldn't stop thinking about that mural because I just kept thinking Nike put all this faith in me and I couldn't let them down. And that was a huge impetus and incentive for me to heal.
That was a part of our strategic marketing plan.
No, I mean, it worked. But, I just, Catholic guilt, if nothing else. I mean, I had to get to that starting line and I had to show up in place.
Well, Joan Benoit Samuelson did show up in LA at the first Olympic women's marathon.
Approaching the stadium or the Coliseum, wondering if anybody was going to be in there. I said, who's going to be out there on a hot Sunday morning watching a bunch of women run 26.2 miles? And then I actually heard the crowd get to its feet before I entered the tunnel. And then I didn't know if I was capable of coming into the light.
The first Olympic marathon of modern times was held in 1896. Because of sexist and pseudoscientific beliefs of the supposed fragility of women's bodies in endurance sports, it took 88 years before women were permitted to compete at Olympic level. Joan Benoit Samuelson was the first female Olympic marathon gold medalist who wore Nikes, of course.
The 84 Olympics was a huge jump for Nike between following and leading and between amateur and professional.
So what accounted for Nike's success during the 1984 Games? Here's Julie Dixon.
Americans aren't good at some things. They're not good at manufacturing, for example, in the textile area. But the one thing they're great at is marketing. And I really think they're the best in the world at that. And they knew how to get to the emotional part of the consumer's brain and heart, whereas Adidas just went after the technical side.
Converse was the official Olympic sponsor at the LA Games, yet...
So when they did the big survey at the end, we came out in the top 3 as an official sponsor, which of course we got labeled guerrilla marketeers, and we changed the face of marketing from that point forward. The IOC was not happy with us, and all the official people were boo-hooing us, and the fans and the athletes loved us, so we did the right thing.
That year, 124 out of 140 national teams wore Adidas, a statistic perhaps facilitated by Horst Dassler's friendship with the IOC president. Yet still, Nike athletes won 63 medals, many of them by high-profile U.S. athletes like Carl Lewis. Sales in California increased by double digits.
They had a huge party. They had Randy Newman himself playing the piano, I Love LA, and it was a wild party. And it turned out to be, the party of the Olympics. By then, Rob felt that he had pretty much completed his Olympic marketing campaign.
Surrounded by athletes and celebrities at the beach party, Nike's head of marketing, Rob Strasser, was right to bask in the success of the campaign. Still, he knew that the success of the LA Olympics would have to be rebottled again and again. One gold medal winner, a young Converse-wearing basketball player from North Carolina, caught Strasser's eye.
And he was talking to David Falk on the sand, and they weren't talking Olympics.
David Falk was a sports agent who, 2 years previously, had negotiated the first $1 million NBA shoe deal with New Balance for James Worthy of the LA Lakers.
Rob knew that the future had to be with individual athletes and make them superstars rather than endorse teams like the Chicago Bulls. He just wanted one guy who was the right guy. And that's the discussion that they had that night. And Rob and David Falk had been doing deals for a long time, and they knew each other well and they trusted each other. So that conversation that night is what led to Nike signing Jordan.
That conversation and the decision that followed would transform the sneaker industry in the sports world forever. But before Nike could be like Mike and truly capitalize on the biggest basketball player of all time, the Oregon running shoe company would be blindsided by a tenacious competitor who had discovered the swoosh's Achilles heel.
So there you go, another episode of Sneakernomics. Hope you enjoyed it. Nick, what can we expect next time?
Next time we have a good one coming up. We're going to talk about, the impact of Michael Jordan on sport, on culture, on shoes. We're going to talk about the shoe wars really heating up now. There's more competitors. There's more, options available to consumers. And we're also going to talk about now that other 50% of the market is being tapped. So companies have figured out, no, we can also market to women and sneakers too. So a lot of stuff coming up next time.
Can't wait to hear it. Make sure you tune in next time for Sneakernomics.
Sneakernomics is written and presented by me, Nicholas Smith. The drama is written by Al Smith, and additional presenting is by Ace. Archive was taken from ABC's coverage of the 1984 Olympics. Editing is by Peter Ringrose, and the series is produced by Sasha Yevtushenko. Full cast and crew credits can be found on the episode webpage. Sneakernomics is a BBC audio production for BBC Radio 4.
Before you go, can I quickly tell you about Tricky, BBC Radio 4's discussion podcast that's back for another series. I'm Miles, one of the producers. We put 4 people in a room, face to face. There's no social media to hide behind or presenter to get in the way. Tricky is all about honest opinions on subjects that our guests really care about. Like at what age should you be able to vote?
I think if you were to strip the vote from anyone, I'd strip it from older people. Forget this stewardship thing.
Why do we need to strip it from anyone?
We don't need to strip it from anyone. I never brought that into the conversation. What I'm saying is, but if we were going to strip it from anyone, it wouldn't be people that are under 25.
So expect strong feelings in adult subjects. Everything from living with HIV to surviving sexual assault. Discover more conversations like this by searching for Tricky on BBC Sounds.